Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made. Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubaar's Godzilla Palooza. Greetings, citizens of Tokyo. I am Zazubaar, and I just witnessed your city get totally demolished for about the 15th time. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 2003 film Godzilla Tokyo SOS, where that event happened again, and it's the center point of the narrative today on Godzilla Palooza Day 29. We're nearing the conclusion of this long romp through the Godzilla films, and today we're going to be taking a look at what many people consider to be kind of sort of the end of the Millennium Godzilla series, given the ending of this film, though it isn't really entirely true since the next film is. But in the way the film is written and the way the characters speak, it kind of is the true conclusion of the Millennium series, especially in its ending and in its overall narrative, and I really like that about it. In fact, just basing it on the Millennium series, I would have been totally fine with Tokyo SOS being the definitive conclusion of the Millennium series of Godzilla. But the next film is more of a conclusion to Godzilla in general. Tokyo SOS is much more of a definitive and well-done conclusion to Millennium Godzilla. But all in all, it's not the ending of the Millennium series, so we'll have our spats, but it kinda is, but really isn't. Tokyo SOS is the only direct sequel to a previous Millennium Godzilla film, with this being Act 2 of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla from 2002, and this film is a direct continuation of that story, basically taking place not even a year after the events of Godzilla's battle with Mechagodzilla in Shinagawa City, otherwise known as a district of Tokyo. And being a direct sequel gives it a much more tight and epic and more standalone narrative than the previous film did, because the previous film was so preoccupied with setting up Godzilla again for a new universe that I feel like Tokyo SOS, not having to do that, is much more concrete and more interesting and more epically toned because of that difference, and because of it using the events of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla as a crutch to tell its story, and its story is quite a good one. The ultimate thing is that you really don't even have to see Godzilla against Mechagodzilla to watch Tokyo SOS. I mean, basically all the events that are integral to the narrative of this film are talked about and shown or basically explained. Kiyu running wild, Kiyu's construction, although they don't call him Kiyu in this film, now he's just called Mecha G. I hate that name as well. Wish they would call him Mechagodzilla, that's what he is. I do ultimately, I like that this film is quite standalone despite being a sequel, and that all the events of the previous film that are needed to watch this one are explained or shown. So, while I do like Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and did ultimately recommend it, I say if you don't want, if you're just watching that to set up this film, don't watch Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, because this film is superior to that film and doesn't require any prior viewing of that film to understand it. Yes, it brings up and is a direct continuation of those events, but again, it mentions and explains all of those events. So if you're just watching against Mechagodzilla to set up Tokyo SOS, don't do that. If you're watching Godzilla against Mechagodzilla because it's a all-in-all good Godzilla movie, then watch it, sure. But Tokyo SOS is superior, a much more original and interesting tale, and doesn't require the previous film. So, unless you want to watch Godzilla against Mechagodzilla to watch Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, skip that film and move on to Tokyo SOS, because all the events of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla that are integral to this story are explained. So it's quite good in that regard as well. And overall, the plot is just much more interesting than the previous film, though I suppose I should, summarize it before I, get into the details on why. So, of course, I shall do that now. But I just wanted to kind of establish my overall feelings that I really, really like Tokyo SOS. It's a very epic, kind of sort of remake, but not really. It's more of a really interesting reworking of the original Mothra vs. Godzilla, but has much more different and cool elements to set up some of the events of that film, but ultimately comes off of it as its own original thing, where it is definitely noticeable as a remake, but has its own things where that's not as apparent as the previous film was in its remake roots. So I do really, really like it for that. The elements of Mothra vs. Godzilla that are here are as follows. Basically what happens is after the events of the previous film, Mechagodzilla is being reconstructed after the damage he received in that film by Godzilla, and is being reconstructed without the use of the DNA computer, so that way, well, they're in there, but he doesn't run wild in the same way he did previously, and he's all in all not as uncontrollable. The problem is that his Absolute Zero system, the big freezing gun that he had in the previous film, is destroyed, and they can't rebuild it because it's such a rare material. So they have to use something else, which they use in the form of a hyper laser. And they also put on a different arm, and all this stuff is going on. The main events of the film are that Godzilla is becoming restless at the bottom of the sea because, as the twin fairies of Mothra Island explain, he is coming to seek the bones of his ancestor to return them to the sea, and that's why he's attracted to Mechagodzilla. The other thing is that Mothra is actually going to declare war on humanity if they do not return the bones of Godzilla to the sea, because if they don't do that, they're upsetting what Mothra stands for, and that is the stability of nature. And as Mothra stands for, life must be lived in the time that nature allows, and the basic idea of Mechagodzilla goes against that, so Mothra hates Mechagodzilla and demands that humanity destroy it and return Godzilla's bones to the sea, so that way the creature can rest in peace, because in a much more intriguing way than the previous film did, all life is sacred and must be maintained no matter how evil. Or no matter how important to the survival of a species, the balance of life and death must be maintained. And basically what happens is Mothra will fill in for Mechagodzilla in killing the current day Godzilla, so that way Mechagodzilla isn't needed. At first, the Japanese government and the people behind Mechagodzilla are totally against this because they think it's stupid. Why would they get rid of their best weapon in killing Godzilla just at the word of some twin fairies and giant moth? And also, in this continuity, the original Mothra is definitely in this continuity because it's brought up. And also one of the characters returns in this film, by the way, fucking awesome, in the form of a character named Chujo. And basically what happens is, Mothra destroyed Tokyo in that film. So the government's kind of like, why would we listen to it now? I really like that point, and it makes both sides of the argument valid. And here's ultimately the thing. Then the Japanese government, seeing Mothra and its capabilities in fighting Godzilla, because Mothra is attracted to Tokyo once Godzilla finally returns and attacks Tokyo, because Chujo and his grandson, Shun, construct out of school desks the Mothra symbol from the original Mothra film out of desks, because apparently in that film they drew it on an airport runway, which attracts Mothra to the area. And the same thing happens here. Mothra comes to Tokyo to fight Godzilla. Mothra and Godzilla fight, and Mothra seems at first more than capable of fighting Godzilla. And Mothra seems to be able to beat Godzilla. But then it's revealed that, like in the original Mothra vs. Godzilla, Mothra is near the end of its life cycle and must be reborn. So that way it can't finish. So then it can't finish off Godzilla with the time it has left. So once Mothra begins to die and can no longer fight Godzilla, the Japanese government realizes that they have no choice than to launch Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla is launched. The Twin Fairies freak out because they didn't want this, but they kind of understand that because Mothra is dying, the Japanese government has no choice. And Mechagodzilla and Godzilla have a much superior and unique fight opposed to the previous film. But then an egg on Infant Island hatches, revealing twin Mothra larvae, kind of like the original Mothra vs. Godzilla, who both swim to Tokyo to carry on the fight of their mother. Mothra is officially killed when she jumps out in front of her larvae, who are about to be killed by Godzilla, and entirely explodes. The Mothra larvae wrap up Godzilla in their webbing, which they did in the original Mothra vs. Godzilla, again a reference I like. And in order to get rid of Godzilla, Mechagodzilla goes wild again. But this time, rather than attacking the city like he did in the previous film, kind of like the original Godzilla would, he understands that this is the end of the Godzilla reign. It's no longer needed. So he jumps onto Godzilla and wraps wires around him and flies out to sea to drop itself and Godzilla into the trench to sleep in peace forever. They do this, and the human cast is left to lament the events of the film. And as said by the Prime Minister, man has finally learned its lesson. We've learned that we can no longer mess around with nature. Quite full circle for the Godzilla character, in that the original intention of the original Godzilla was that man experimented with nuclear weapons and nature created a monster to say to man, you can't do this. And I like how that's brought up in this film, that first of all, we made a mistake to create Godzilla by testing atomic weapons. Again, we crossed the boundary between mortals and gods. And then we created a weapon out of the bones of that monster to kill the present-day Godzilla. When will man learn? And man finally learns when both things drop themselves in the sea to live peacefully forever. And I really like that. It's definitely the only way you can fully end the Godzilla saga, by fully having man understand its mistakes and seemingly going on to rectify them. Though there is a stinger at the end of the credits to say that they haven't learned their lesson, which I like. And overall, the plot is quite good, in that it brings up plenty of unique elements, but at the same time is a decent remake of Mothra vs. Godzilla. I like the fact that Mechagodzilla is in it, because we've never had him in a film with Mothra before, and it's an interesting dynamic between them, and I like that all the monsters are integral in the story. And the plot itself is well paced, in that the build up to it is quite good, and the payoff is excellent with the last 40-minute long monster fight. And overall, the plot is well told and well paced. My problem with the story, and this is probably my only problem, is that there are a few too many elements that are borrowed from the previous film. Mainly in the human cast, in that the main problem is that the main character of Airman Chujo, the nephew of Chujo from the original Mothra, he is a little bit too here's the thing. The events in the film are too similar because he has a confrontation with one of the Mechagodzilla, pilots. Very similar to Nakani's confrontation with the brother of the guy that she was the responsible for killing, and it's too similar to that. It's not as brought to the forefront or as part of the main story as it is in Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, but it's there and it's noticeable, and I don't really like it because it's not as developed and not as interesting. They just seem to come into a confrontation because one of them is a mechanic and one of them is a gunner, so it makes sense that they'd fight, right? No, not really. It just seems to be that they're clashing interests, and I don't really like that because it's generic and not entirely developed and is resolved way too quickly. And overall, his characters is Akubo is his name, is way too similar to the mean pilot from the previous film. So I really, really don't like that. It's a little bit too generic, and the other plot point that doesn't work for me is that Godzilla blasts his heat ray at Mechagodzilla and knocks out his control system, just like at the end of the previous film when they had to go down to Mechagodzilla and repair the control system. They do the same thing in this film. It's just too similar and is a little bit too basic plot point. So the story is has too many points of rehash of the previous film to be truly original, but for the most part it is quite original, except for those few elements. And overall, the plot is well told and for the most part original. So it's an interesting Godzilla story. It's not entirely original, though, for the most part. And I like the reworkings of the original Mothra vs. Godzilla. So I really like the story, and it's quite well paced and has quite a good build up and quite a good payoff. There are just too many elements that seem to be rehash of the previous film, like the confrontations between the human cast and the ending part where they have to repair Mechagodzilla's control system. It's a little bit too similar and a little bit too focused to not be rehashed, so that bothers me. Aside from that, though, I do like the plot. That'll bring us into the human cast. I've already kind of touched on them, but I'll just talk about the ones I want to discuss. I do ultimately like our main protagonist of Airman Chujo. He's a little bit too confrontational and a little bit too, what's the word? He's a little bit too mean to really be a likable protagonist, though, in that he starts crap for no reason. He is the sole reason why we're having all these confrontations with Akubo, because he's kind of snobby. He thinks that he knows Mechagodzilla better than anyone because he's repaired him. So when you've got this gunner who comes along and is the pilot of Mechagodzilla and he's not really respecting him, he disses him. It comes off as too much of his fault, and because he's a protagonist, you don't want to have your protagonist of a movie starting fights over seemingly nothing, especially over a stupid reason like, oh, I'm a snob and I know this thing better than you do. When really, Akubo doesn't show that much disrespect for Mechagodzilla, not enough to start a fight over it. If it was more, I would be totally behind Chujo. But at the end of the day, he's a little bit too into a fight to be likable and to be a good protagonist. He's also way too internalized for me. Like, there's this part where this girl who he's clearly romantically interested in, though she's not nearly developed enough, her name is Asusa, I think, or is it Asuka? I forget. I think it might be Asusa, though. Either one. And she and him are romantically involved, and there's this one scene where they're talking, and she's yelling at him because he clearly shows no interest in women and is just obsessed with machines. And it's a funny scene, and one that kind of tells us leagues about his character without seeing it. But the problem with it is that it makes him a little bit too internalized for me, because we don't know if what she's saying is true. It's implied, but it doesn't really mold itself to be a part of the story. It just comes off as a character flaw that doesn't go anywhere. So I really don't like that, and it's a little bit clunky. He is ultimately likable, I guess. He's interesting. He's a little bit too overdramatic, though. Like, he starts fights for no reason, and he just overall, he's a little bit too overdramatic for me. So he's ultimately likable, but he has a few too many flaws make it difficult to like him as a Godzilla protagonist. The rest of the human cast is again quite good, though underdeveloped for sure. The main two that bug me are Akubo and Chujo's love interest, Asuka or Asuza, something. In that she's, again, clearly romantically interested in Chujo, and they clearly have a history together, but it doesn't go anywhere. They just seem to be interested in each other. We're supposed to buy them as somewhat friendly or anti-friendly, or some kind of relationship is there. It's not developed. It's not really integral to the story, and it feels like the way it's hinted at it, it's almost like it should be, and I don't like that. Like, I feel like if you're gonna have a plot element like that, you have to make it part of the story, and make it interesting and developed. And they don't develop it, or really, it's not even really an integral part of the plot. And if it's not, don't even bring it up. In fact, her character ultimately in the story is quite pointless. She just seems to almost be like, we need to have a female pilot for Mechagodzilla because Nakani in the previous film is a really good character. So I feel like she's just a response to that. And Nakani is in this film briefly, and I like her cameo because she cements her parallelization with Mechagodzilla in this film, but she only has 2 scenes, and they're both quite well done though. Asuka seems to be too focused on this relationship to be that interesting, and she's really not that interesting, and she ultimately feels superfluous in the story, and has too much screen time for that not to be a problem. Akubo is very annoying. He is extremely arrogant, and that feels like that's the reason why we should like him. I don't find that likable. I mean, I say that as kind of a hypocrite because I'm a big fan of the film version of Tony Stark, and he's arrogant, but it's extremely different in that Akubo is an underdeveloped kind of arrogant, and one that is, not only is it not developed, but it's also not very interesting. So if you're gonna have your character be arrogant, there has to be a reason for it, and there isn't for Akubo, and he just comes off as annoying and unlikable. And at the end of the day, he's one of the protagonists, so not good. Aside from that, though, the only other human character I want to talk about is Chujo. You know, his Uncle Chujo, as I'll call him, from the original Mothra. He's very well done in this film because he's he's not bitter, but he seems like he's getting there. Like, just if a couple more events happened, he would become bitter. Like, he's become kind of disenfranchised with the rest of the world in that people are making the same mistakes that they made back when he was a young man, i.e. building Mechagodzilla, pissing off Mothra, and that makes him kind of a bitter man at the end of the film. And I also really like his character because he says some of the coolest lines in Godzilla history. Like when he talks about how or why Mechagodzilla is a problem. You know, like when he talks about how man crossed a boundary between mortals and gods when we created Mechagodzilla. Awesome lines. And extremely natural for his character. He doesn't come off as an awesome actor delivering awesome lines with an underdeveloped character. No. He comes off as an awesome actor delivering awesome lines with an awesome character. He's very well developed, unlike the rest of the cast. I feel like the rest of the cast is underdeveloped. That might just be because he's been in the film before, but ultimately you get a good sense of his character just from Tokyo SOS, so I think he's a very well done character. And is probably my favorite in the entire film because of his awesome line delivery and well done characterization. So I absolutely love Uncle Chujo. And as I said in my Mothra vs. Godzilla review, he's played by the guy who played Professor Mirai in both Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. And I really like him as a Godzilla actor, and this is unfortunately his last appearance in the franchise, so we'll miss you. But he's an awesome actor, and he's awesome in this movie. So at the end of the day, the human cast is, for the most part, well done, but I feel like for the most part they're also underdeveloped, and given how much screen time they have and how many interesting things are brought up about their characters, I wish they were more developed. The only one who I feel like is developed is Uncle Chujo. His nephew is not very developed, and that's a problem because he's our protagonist. Akubo is underdeveloped, and Asuka's underdeveloped, so I feel like this film, again, less so than against Mechagodzilla, but nearly to a similar degree, the script needed to be more expansive than it is. And I wouldn't have minded the movie being longer as long as we could have gotten more development for the characters. Because I like them all and they're interesting. I need them to be more well developed. And Chujo and Akubo are good examples of that. But in the end so is Asuza to a worse degree. She's superfluous in the story at the end. But Uncle Chujo is quite well developed, and he's probably my favorite character. So that'll bring us into the monsters. I don't actually have a lot to say about them. It might just be because individually they don't have a lot of screen time. I think out of all of them, Mothra has the most screen time. And because of that, we'll talk about Mothra first. It's kind of a back to basics Mothra characterization, in that I didn't like the GMK characterization of her, and I'm glad that we're not continuing with that. But it's kind of a mix between the Heisei Mothra and the Showa Mothra. She's kind of the goddess that she was in Mothra and Godzilla: The Battle for Earth, but she's also more of not like the Twin Fairies are not representing the Earth's. The Twin Fairies are not as goddess-like as they were in Battle for Earth. I mean, they're close, but it's kind of a good mix, and I ultimately like it. And I like that Mothra is kind of going back to her original characterization in that, yes, I will defend humanity and I will protect their ideals, but just in case they turn bad, I have to destroy them and teach them a lesson. And I really like that, and I ultimately like this version of Mothra quite a bit. And I think that she's a good addition to the cast in this continuity. I feel like she fits well. And I like how her character is kind of established in the previous film, in that the canon of the original Mothra is present in the first film, and I like that that's carried over here. It's a good use of continuity, so I really like that. So overall, her character is great. I especially like how the events of Mothra vs. Godzilla of her character, like her dying and the carrying on of her brood, is worked into the story in a natural way and doesn't just come off as clunky homage. So I really, really like this version of Mothra. Her design is quite good. It's not as much of a good redesign as the GMK design was. I mean, I prefer her character in this film over the GMK one, but I liked her design better in GMK. But this is kind of a back to basics Mothra design. She's still a little bit more streamlined than the Heisei one was, but she ultimately doesn't look much different than she did in the Showa series, which not a problem, but it's noticeable. So I do ultimately like this version of Mothra. And she fits mostly really well into this story and comes off as a natural part of it. And I like that she's representing that balance of nature again. But she's also representing the good parts of humanity, in that she's going to desperately try to keep those in check. So I like this characterization of Mothra. Let's talk about Mechagodzilla. He's mostly, I don't have a lot to say about him because he's mostly carried over from the previous film. Again, I like this version of Mechagodzilla quite a bit. He's just a little bit too clunky for me, and what exactly his, since this version of Mechagodzilla is not just a simple robot like the 90s one was, I need a little bit more stronger motivation. Like in the previous film, he ran wild and destroyed the city. In this film, he doesn't do that. It's a little inconsistent, though this one makes more sense, and to be fair, it made sense in the previous film as well, but his character doesn't get enough development. So I feel like too much of the time he is a generic robot, and when he's not, it's a little clunky. I like that he is in a way representing the original Godzilla, in that the original Godzilla kind of just wanted to rest in peace, and now he gets a chance to do that. My problem is that the fact that he is the original Godzilla is buried and buried and buried. And this is in the fact that he has a relationship with Chujo. When Chujo gets thrown out of Mechagodzilla in the last part, because Chujo is the one who fixes Mechagodzilla. and it's inside the cockpit when Mechagodzilla flies Godzilla to the sea, and Mechagodzilla intentionally throws him out so that way he doesn't drown as well. The problem is that he says sayonara something. I'm not quite sure what the word means, but it's a Japanese word. Sayonara Yoshido is what he says. And fine, it's cool, but ultimately it doesn't well represent the original Godzilla. I was full on board with Mechagodzilla being the original Godzilla. Flying Godzilla into the sea to rest in peace. Was not on board with him being friends with Chujo. It doesn't make any sense. So I like his character in this film in that ultimate last 10 minutes. I just don't like the fact that he saves Chujo. I would have been perfectly fine with Chujo dying. In fact, I would have preferred that, because Chujo kind of represented the realization of man that man made a mistake. And I was more than okay with him dying with Mechagodzilla. And since that doesn't happen, the ending comes off as a tad corny. It's ultimately a dramatic and fitting ending for the Millennium series, but it is a little corny, especially with the fact that this is supposed to be the original Godzilla. And again, I was fine with Mechagodzilla intentionally drowning himself in Godzilla. More than okay with that. That seems like something the original Godzilla would do if he wasn't needed to keep man in check anymore, which he's not. But the friendship between him and Chujo is it's not necessary. And I really would have been totally fine with Chujo dying, because I think that would have said something more about the realizations of man and Mechagodzilla's character. So I think ultimately Mechagodzilla is quite well done. He's ultimately the integral part of this being the ending of the Millennium series, in that he's basically the one who says Godzillas aren't needed anymore, and he drowns himself and basically his son. I just wish that he didn't become friends with Chujo. That seems a little corny to me. But at the end of the day, I do like that arc. So let's talk about Godzilla. Kind of the same problem I had with him in the previous film. He's a little bit too much of the generic destructive Godzilla. I do like that it's brought to the forefront that he's attracted to the bones of his ancestor inside of Mechagodzilla. Again, I like that that's brought up, but I ultimately think that his character is a little lost on me. There's nothing really said about him wanting to take revenge on humanity. He feels extremely, extremely animalistic. And again, I don't like that. As I said in my Megaguirus review, he's a lot more badass than Godzilla was in Megaguirus, but that's just because he has more screen time and does more badass things. And his fight with Mechagodzilla is great, and his fight with Mothra is great. But his characterization is a little bit on the bland side, and I don't like that. I think he fits in well with the ultimate conclusion of the film, with him and Mechagodzilla drowning in the Pacific Ocean. I just wish his character was a little bit more three-dimensional. And kind of like the human cast, Godzilla is a little bit underdeveloped in this film. So, and I understand that there are going to be some of you watching this review going, why does it bother you that Godzilla, a giant monster, doesn't get a characterization? It bothers me because he's technically the main character and the main driving force of the story. And the fact of the matter is that he's been developed previously, why not now? So it bothers me that he's a tad on the generic side. I'm missing some of that tragedy that we had in GMK and the Heisei Godzilla, so he's ultimately badass, but I like a little more than just being badass in my Godzilla characterizations. So I kind of missed that as well. But at the end of the day, he is badass. And I would have been disappointed if this had been the end of the Millennium series with kind of a generic characterization for Godzilla. I mean, in Final Wars, it's not much better, but if this was the end, I would have been slightly disappointed with this being the end of Godzilla's character. So I do like the ending and his involvement in it. I just wish that his character was a little bit more developed. Like, kind of I feel the same way about the human cast as well. So Godzilla's a little bit underdeveloped in my opinion. Again, I love this Godzilla design. I think the scar tissue added on the design is a welcome addition. It doesn't, since this is a different continuity, it doesn't bother me that it's not, you know, Regenerator G1 is clearly not present, because in Godzilla 2000 it was said that it only takes a couple of hours for Godzilla to heal even the most mortal of wounds. But since this is a different continuity, I really don't care. But though it does bother me a little bit that it takes that long for him to heal a wound. It is ultimately a big wound, but I don't know. It's cool, and it's nice to see Godzilla having some scar tissue. So it's a good, intricate detail, one that I like, and it looks cool on the Godzilla design. So I like that. It's just it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But again, since Regenerator G1 is a different continuity, I really don't care. So that's my take on Godzilla. He's a tad underdeveloped, but I like his place in the ending of the film, in that Mechagodzilla realizes that we don't need any more Godzillas, so let's just bury ourselves at the bottom of the sea. That'll bring us into the themes and slash allegory, though there's not much allegory in this film. It's more themes, but I kind of already touched on it. I think this film is mostly about what Uncle Chujo says about life must be lived in the time that nature allows. But I think we can mostly blanket that out to man must not interfere with the course of nature. That if you do, you're going to create monsters. Godzilla and Mechagodzilla withstanding. Godzilla being the monster that destroys you, and Mechagodzilla being the thing that you can't control. So, I really like that theme. It's appropriate for Godzilla, and I like that it's got a nice wrap-up at the end of the film. Though I am ultimately glad that this isn't the end of the Millennium series. I mean, it's a good wrap-up, but not one that's flawless like Destroya was. So I'm glad that this isn't the end, but what I do like about it is that, kind of like the question I posed at the end of my Godzilla vs. Destroyer review of can man ever redeem itself, and at least in this film it seems so, that the ending does raise some questions about that. Though it does seem that man has the capability to redeem itself, and it does that by getting rid of both Mechagodzilla and Godzilla. And I do ultimately like that. It's a tad corny, not entirely, it doesn't ruin the movie, but it is a tad corny. But I do ultimately like the realization, and I like the fact that we finally got what I said of man redeeming itself. It's not 100% convincing, but it's enough, and I think that it's a welcome theme and a welcome addition to the Godzilla franchise because that theme is present. The theme itself is mostly well developed throughout the story. I like that it's basically the crux of the story, with Mechagodzilla being repaired, some people saying that it should remain in disrepair, Mothra's involvement, and Godzilla returning. So the theme of man not being able to mess around with nature anymore is well developed, unlike the characters. Though it is a tad clunky in places. So I like the theme. I think it's clunky in that I don't entirely buy that man has fully redeemed itself. Because Mechagodzilla did most of the work. I mean, what did man do? It's not like they buried Mechagodzilla. Sure, we get the sense that after this battle they're going to scrap Mechagodzilla anyway, but I would have liked to see man do that. Or, I would have been more fine with this. The end of the credits is a shot zooming out Godzilla cells, that the Godzilla cells could be used to build another Mechagodzilla, and they're inside of a DNA tank. It's a good stinger, showing that there could be more Godzillas. But and I would have been cool if, wouldn't it have been cool if they would have destroyed them? I'm sure they locked them in a vault, but you could easily take them out and build another Mechagodzilla. I would have been more happy if they would have destroyed the cells. I think that would have mostly wrapped up the theme and would have made this a more solid conclusion of the Millennium series. You could say to me, but Zazubaar, didn't you love the ending of Godzilla vs. Destroya in that it said that man can never redeem itself and that there must always be a Godzilla? Yeah, but this isn't that. It's more clunky. And I think that it's a little confusing. This ending is much, much more confusing than Destroya's was. Destroya's was very, very clear in its theme, and its wrap-up of that theme with what happened to Junior. This is a little more cryptic, and that's not a good thing because this is supposed to be the end. So, it's too cryptic. I don't get the sense of what it's trying to be. I get the idea that maybe they're going to build another Mechagodzilla, but that needs to be more apparent. Like, wouldn't it have been cool if someone would have grabbed the cells and pulled them out and said, oh, they're going to do it again? Or again, if they would have wrapped up their theme more neatly I would have had them destroy the cells. Either one I would have been fine with. It would have been more apparent what the theme was going for, but all in all, the ending is a little clunky in that regard. So the theme is well done, just a tad clunky, and not as good as Godzilla vs. Destroyers was in terms of ending a Godzilla series. That'll bring us into the effects. These effects are fantastic. They're just as well done, if not more well done, than the previous film. The CGI is even better. There's this great shot of Godzilla swimming underwater while being hit by torpedoes. And overall, the effects are seamless, elaborate, cool to watch, and make the last 40 minutes of this movie fucking epic. Oh my god, the fight between Godzilla, Mothra, and Mechagodzilla is absolutely fantastic. It's epic, a very original and dynamic Godzilla fight, and one that uses its modern effects to its advantage rather than being a stale, basic Godzilla love tap fight. So, I love the last 40 minutes of this movie. The effects make it worth watching, and overall, the effects are absolutely fantastic. Mothra looks amazing. The way she flies, the way she attacks Godzilla, it's amazing. It's well done, it's organic looking, and overall, is extremely dynamic. So Mothra, very, very well done. I don't have a ton to say about the music score because I feel ultimately the same about it as I felt about Mechagodzilla. It's done by the same composer, clearly, and it's overall basically the same. There are quite a few nice new cues of dramatic choir music that's there to fit in with Mothra. And the reworking of the Mothra song is decent, but overall it's quite as good, if not a little bit more dramatic, than the previous film, but ultimately is the same and just as commendable. So, again, I think the score is fantastic. It's just the same as the previous film, just with a few new additions that are welcome. So overall, the score is great, just nothing too different from the previous film. All in all, Godzilla Tokyo SOS is a fantastic Godzilla movie. Despite my problems with the characters and the theme being somewhat clunky, all in all, it's a great supposed wrap-up of the Millennium series. One with plenty of great monster fights, one with plenty of interesting and good reworkings of classic Godzilla films like Mothra vs. Godzilla. And has a tight, original story that's a good continuation and more importantly, an improved continuation of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, and one of the most fun and enjoyable and epic films in the franchise. I highly recommend it. I think you should definitely check it out. It's a great Godzilla film. It has its faults. And ultimately, while I would love to give it a 5 out of 5, I think that there are too many faults with it for me to do that. So kind of like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, I'll give it a 4.5 out of 5. Because of the plot qualms, and because of my qualms with the theme. Aside from that, though, I think it's fantastic. So I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. I highly recommend it. Check it out. That'll about do it for this review of Godzilla Tokyo SOS. And I'll see you guys tomorrow when we finally end this crazy journey. Only one more review left when we commence Operation Final War. Join me tomorrow when we take a look at the final film in the Godzilla franchise, Godzilla Final Wars. I'll see you guys tomorrow for that review. Sayonara.